My story starts a few years ago. My parents are Ukrainian
refugees, and I saw firsthand the impact that educational access had in their well-being, right? I saw firsthand how lack of educational access affected their well-being, and how also the educational resources that their universities and employers provided them completely changed their life and completely changed my life as well. When I was 15, I was attending an urban public high school in Portland, Oregon, and I really wanted to learn about entrepreneurship, but had nor were there any classes in any other high school in the Portland metro area at the time. And I also didn't know any entrepreneurs. I had literally no way of learning about entrepreneurship. And so I ended up cold emailing about 100 local CEOs and entrepreneurs asking to interview them. That was the only way that I could fathom learning about entrepreneurship. And what happened was that pretty much everybody either didn't reply or said no. But one person said that they'd be open to chatting with a group of us. And that's this guy, Rick Tarosi. And so over the course of my junior year of high school, I ended up convincing a basement of a local theater to donate their space. And we hosted 12 free live conversations with local entrepreneurs and business leaders. And that sort of series of events was called TILE, Talks on Innovation, Leadership, and Entrepreneurship. What we started realizing is that these talks were incredibly successful, right? There was an immense demand to learn from local entrepreneurs. We regularly had 100 students from all over Portland pack into a basement to learn about entrepreneurship. And we also started realizing that this model was incredibly scalable, right? If we could, have students put together these events, and if we gave, local entrepreneurs the opportunity to come speak and have a conversation with students, and if we could get local theaters to donate their basements, we could scale this model all over the world. And that's exactly what we did. Over the course of the next 3 years, TILE became the world's largest conversation series. We scaled to about 500 locations in 50 countries, and ended up being one of the largest hosters of educational events globally. And so we were incredibly, incredibly lucky. We were this entirely student-run organization hosting events everywhere from Nicaragua to New Delhi. And one of our events was in the war zone in Yemen. And I couldn't understand why we were getting more students to come to our events in the middle of the Yemeni war zone than our events in Portland or LA or New York. And this is Mohammed Al-Adlani. He was a student who created the TILE chapter in Yemen. And I became really, really fascinated by this situation. The more I learned about Yemen, the more I realized that in Yemen, educational resources were unbelievably limited. Their educational system had been defunct for over 4 years, and students were desperate for learning, to the point that students would come from all over Sana'a, and even in some cases 10 to 20 miles outside of Sana'a, the capital city of Yemen, to come hear local entrepreneurs speak. The more I learned about Yemen, the more I became obsessed with this question of how do you deliver learning in a region where students have no internet access, no laptop access, no functioning educational system, and where me as an American student couldn't travel, couldn't send packages, couldn't send money, and where virtually no nonprofit was active. In my opinion, it was one of the most challenging, but also one of the most unique opportunities to create a dramatic difference from an educational access point of view. And so my first attempt at this was, trying to create a series of video courses, much like some of the video courses we all create today, and send them to Mohammed and his students. I convinced a few professors at a local college to record some video lectures, sent them to Mohammed, and this is exactly what he said. Less than 24% of students in Yemen have access to the internet. And so these video courses, and sort of my assumption that video courses would democratize learning and training, kind of like Coursera, was supposed to, I realized that was completely false, right? Virtually everyone would not be able to access these courses. And after banging my head against the wall for a few months, I ended up asking Mohammed this question that ended up changing the course of my life. I asked him, how many students have access to texting, WhatsApp, or cellular? And what I started realizing was that even though pretty much nobody in Yemen had access to a laptop or internet, almost every student had access to a phone. And if we could figure out a way to deliver learning via text message and WhatsApp, the tools that students already had, we could make learning dramatically more accessible. Over the course of the next 6 months, we ended up working with a series of professors at Harvard and Babson College to create the first text message course. We packaged a college-level entrepreneurship course into a series of text messages that were designed to teach students about core entrepreneurial concepts and help them practice over the course of a few days and weeks. And what we found was that this model was unbelievably effective. Even when we piloted it in the United States, we saw completion and satisfaction rates of over 90%. compared to about 5% for traditional video-based courses. And so we realized that there was something here. When reflecting on why it worked, we started realizing that it worked for one really simple principle. It met people where they are. Even in the US, learners who wanted to learn about entrepreneurship had to go to a video platform, right? They had to go through a number of clicks to access learning content, and that learning content was incredibly long and wasn't built around their life. And so by breaking learning down into text messages and really digestible chunks that anybody could access, the learning ended up meeting people where they are and was designed around people, right? By designing around students in Yemen, we had stumbled upon a learning model that worked for a lot of people. And what we started realizing the more research we did is that there was a bunch of research from Stanford and Harvard and UPenn about how making learning bite-sized and meeting people where they are was incredibly effective from an educational research point of view. And so we started realizing that apart from there being something here from an educational model point of view, there was something greater at play. As we started thinking about the impact of what this model could do, right? What this model of meeting people where they are could have, we started realizing that there was a massive gap in corporate learning. What we realized specifically was that the learners that oftentimes have the greatest limitations in terms of access to learning are the people around us every single day, right? Cashiers, people on the front lines, managers, and even executives who have virtually no time to learn, but need learning the most. If you think about it, companies that we all represent here today spend 50 years with a typical employee, right? And a typical employee spends more time learning with their company than they do with any other institution that they will ever engage with. What we realized was that companies have this immense opportunity to create impact by delivering learning and by truly making people better. And, in our opinion, that impact is not fully capitalized on. And for us, as we sort of move through the rest of this conversation, that's one thing that I want you all to keep in mind is that the people in this room represent a university that, if it was one large university, would be the largest university in the world. It would be a university of about 2 million people. And we have an opportunity to train millions of people on skills that will improve their salaries, that will make them better people, that will make them better at their jobs. And so, from our point of view, corporate learning is really one of the greatest opportunities for impact today. And so with that in mind, we went on a journey to understand what we could do and what was broken in corporate learning, right? And probably the most important thing is that in many cases, the technology is holding us back. Who here by show of hands knows the origin of the LMS? So I went down a rabbit hole, and what I learned was that the LMS and SCORM files, were initially invented for compliance and tracking by the Department of Defense and the FAA, right? And the fundamental technology actually hasn't changed much since. And so it's interesting because today we're using a tool, right, that was initially invented for risk mitigation to try to create performance and behavior change outcomes, right? And so there's a pretty meaningful mismatch between the technology that we use and the actual impact that we want it to have. Right, and if we dive in a bit deeper, what we're learning is that L&D teams spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours maintaining technology and content that often becomes outdated relatively quickly, right? And a lot of this is not our fault, right? It's because the technology was designed for something else. One of my favorite examples of this is it takes over an hour in many e-learning builders to change one letter, right? And fundamentally, that limits the speed of our teams, right? And it limits our ability to work at the speed of the business. What we've also learned is that a typical L&D team has over 20 tools. I think a few people in this room have well over 50. And the reality is that becomes necessary to create a patchwork and fill all of the gaps that the business is asking us to fill. What we find interesting is that, in terms of time spent, if you look at how a typical L&D team spends their time, the majority of time spent is on driving adoption and managing technology, right? A huge amount of time is spent on managing technology and on managing the patchwork of tools that we work with, right? And on the creation side, because we oftentimes have to deal with tools that don't enable fast creation ends up taking far, far longer than it should, and it limits our ability to spend time on focusing on what really, really matters.
And a lot of this comes down to the learning stack of today, right? If we take a look at sort of a typical learning stack for an organization, it really starts from needs analysis, right? And from the beginning, our ability to understand the needs of the organization is limited, because oftentimes the only way that we can ascertain the needs of the organization is through quarterly or annual employee engagement surveys, right? So right off the bat, we have relatively limited data on what gaps we need to fill. The other part of the needs assessment is sort of departmental requests. And I'm sure all of us are familiar with the very, very interesting departmental requests we get every single day. And oftentimes, the departmental requests don't align with what the business actually needs to improve performance. What we find is that from there, if we sort of go up the stack, on the creation and curation side, we're also oftentimes relatively limited, right? Because on the creation side of things, we have to create experiences that are oftentimes, at a minimum, 30 minutes to an hour long, right? And so right off the bat, we end up spending 40 hours on average to create an hour worth of e-learning. What we also know is that on the curation side, we have an enormous paradox of choice, right? We oftentimes have to pick content from 200,000 or 300,000 courses, many of which haven't been updated recently. One of my favorite stories is that I spoke to a DI leader recently who spent 80 hours going through content, right, in various different learning libraries to try to find the perfect course, and then got so frustrated that he just ended up building it himself, right? And I think that experience holds true for a lot of experiences for all of us. What we find is that if we continue moving up the stack, today, learner data is held hostage by the LMS in many cases, right? And largely because the LMS can only capture certain types of learner data, right? In many cases, it really is only designed to capture compliance and completion. And so what that means is that we really never get the full picture of the impact that we are having as an organization. And then from a content access point of view, today, learners can really only engage in content in two ways, right? Either going to a live, async, or in-person session, or experiencing it async through an LMS or an LXP or a learning app or site. And fundamentally, what this creates is a gap in terms of where people are and where the content is. On average, today, it takes 7 clicks for a learner to get from what they're doing to the right content in the LMS. Who here has gone online shopping before? Hell yeah, okay. So if you are on any website shopping and you have to go through more than 2 clicks, you are out of there and on Amazon for 1-click checkout, right? And the reality is the same thing applies for our learners, right? If they have to go through more than 2 clicks to get the right content, they are out of there and on Google or on TikTok or somewhere else, right? And unfortunately, what this does is it limits the outcomes that we want to create, right? Ultimately, what we are here to do is to build skills, build knowledge, shift cultures and mindsets, and lift performance. And unfortunately, the learning stack that we have today limits our ability to do that. Let's talk about what's broken for learners as well, right? Because unfortunately, a lot of these challenges translate and mirror each other. Today, learners are incredibly busy, right? I think we hear it all the time, especially post-pandemic, folks are insanely busy. And what we're finding is that as a result, people just don't have time to learn, right? And that leads to pretty limited adoption, engagement, and satisfaction rates right off the bat. What we find is that from there, today, most learning experiences are one-time experiences. And what we know is that behavior change and knowledge retention happens over time. And so if a learning experience is a one-time experience, it fundamentally limits our ability to create meaningful long-term outcomes. And unfortunately, it means that you'll forget everything that you learn within 30 days. From there, there's a really meaningful intention and action gap, right? Even if somebody has time to learn, engages in a learning experience, and even if the learning experience is continuous, today there's a very meaningful intention and action gap where people want to take what they've learned and implement it, but it's hard, right? It's hard to, once you've left a learning environment, take what you've learned and implement it, especially when we're talking about really critical skills that require continuous practice, right? If we want somebody to be more empathetic, we need to follow up with them on a regular basis, sometimes for months, to ensure they actually take what they learned and apply it, right? And unfortunately, that's really hard to do today. And ultimately, this limits our ability to prove results and the learner's ability to create meaningful impact for their own career. A really key consideration here, and before we dive into this, who here has used TikTok before? All right. One of the most interesting learnings that we found on the learner side is that today, learners far prefer content to be pushed to them versus pulled. One of my favorite examples of this is Netflix, right? Over the past year and a half, Netflix's stock has dropped by 70%. And the reason is because Netflix's strategy and model no longer works. Netflix struggles immensely with adoption, retention, and engagement. And the reason is because every single time you go to Netflix, you spend an hour and a half trying to figure out what you're going to watch, right? And the reality is, like, look, Netflix has a $20 billion content budget per year, right? And if they're struggling with engagement and retention, it's tough for us as well, right? And so the pull model that we have today, right, where learners go into Elaborate and pull the right content for them, is no longer working because the consumer experience and the consumer expectation has shifted, right? One of the brilliant things about TikTok and Twitter is that they are really, really good at giving you the right information at the right time, and based on your location, based on what they know about you, they are very, very good at sending push notifications and nudges to pull you back in, and then making content that is bite-sized enough to keep you engaged, right? And so what we're finding is that consumer experiences are what we have to compete with, right? We are competing with TikTok and Twitter for our learners' time. And we can borrow a lot from tools like Duolingo and TikTok and Twitter when we think about making really, really effective push experiences for our own organizations. So let's talk about what excellence looks like in the future and what we think excellence will look like for L&D over the course of the next decade. We'll talk about, at a high level, what we want to accomplish as L&D organizations. We'll then dive into our thesis and some of the implications and rationale behind our thesis. And then we'll dive into some of the metrics that matter. So at the very, very core, what all of us in this room want to accomplish is pretty straightforward, right? We really, really care about creating meaningful performance outcomes and building high-performing teams through phenomenal learning experiences, right? That is what we are here to do. And our core thesis is that one of the best ways to do this is on the tools that we already have, right? And one of the core reasons for this is that it's where we spend our time, right? People spend over 80% of their time in tools that we use for communication every single day, and 0.2% of our time in an LMS or LXP. Right? So there's a 400x difference between where we spend our time. And so if we can meet people where they are, then right off the bat, we've solved the number one challenge for teams, right? We've solved the adoption problem. And the reality is, no matter how great our content is, if folks aren't adopting it, it doesn't matter. One of the really interesting things is that if learning emulates communication, it naturally enables really, really good learning practices, right? So first off, we believe that learning should be fundamentally accessible. And access to learning is one of the defining problems for most L&D teams today, especially when it comes to frontline employees. One of the benefits of communication tools is that they are designed from the ground up to be accessible. SMS today is the world's single most accessible piece of technology. It is used by over 5 billion people globally. And the same is true within an organization for tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams, right? It's where people spend their time. And so fundamentally, by using communication tools, learning becomes accessible. If we move down the chain and think about learning being contextual, one of the really interesting things is that Slack and Teams give us a ton of data about the employee experience, right? And I think as L&D teams, and also as organizations in generally, we're just scratching the surface of how we can use data to create really, really highly contextual, TikTok-like experiences for our employees. The other interesting thing is that learning should be continuous, right? We know this, but it's really, really hard to create continuous learning experiences today because we have to pull learners back into the learning experience every time we want to have an additional touch point. One of the benefits of communication tools is that they naturally emulate a conversation, right? And conversations are naturally continuous, right? Your Teams chat with your boss, right, or with one of your peers probably has been taking place for a really long time. And the same can be true for learning experiences, right? What's interesting as well is that if we have far more touch points with a learner, we can capture far more data, right? And so from a learning stack point of view, we no longer have to rely on surveys once a year or once a quarter to understand what's working and what's not working. We can just ask people in the flow of a conversation. And then, in terms of being respectful of learner time, when we build learning into the flow of life, right, we are naturally respectful of people's time because they can decide the terms of that experience. And then because there's constraints, right, because Messages and communications naturally have limitations. It forces us to be concise, but it also forces content to be far more modular. One of the interesting things that we like to think about is that today, the atomic unit of learning, right, the smallest block that we can condense learning into is typically 15 to 30 minutes, typically an hour, right? What this lets us do is condense learning into a much, much smaller bite, right? One of the really cool things about TikTok is that it condenses learning into 30 seconds to a minute, and it forces constraints on the learner and forces people to break content down into a smaller bite, right? And this does the same thing. And most importantly, this lets us bridge to more in-depth experiences as well, right? This is the starting point, ideally, but this lets us naturally bridge learners along and then send them to a more in-depth learning experience when the time is right. One of the really interesting things as well is that a lot of the research validates this, right? Over the past 2 decades, we've seen an explosion in the amount of research being done on how to create effective behavior change. And what we find is that research from Penn and Harvard and Stanford indicates that the best way to create behavior change and the best way to deliver knowledge in a lasting way is to meet people where they are, right? And is to use the tools that we already have. One of my favorite examples of this is UPenn's effort to help drive folks to take the vaccine for COVID. And what they found is that the most effective way, the single most effective way to get somebody to take a vaccine is to just shoot them a text message and do that until they take the vaccine. So from a metrics point of view, one of the things that this lets us do is completely change the way that we think about metrics in a high-performing L&D organization, right? From the beginning, right, adoption and accessibility is a given, right? It becomes a thing that we no longer have to worry about. But also engagement and satisfaction rates become dramatically higher because engaging is as easy as writing back, right? And one of the most important things is that we can actually track performance and confidence lift over time, right? And validate that not just with the learner, but also then engage with other learners in the organization to confirm that this person actually shifted their behavior. I think one of the other really critical things is that this lets us really think about agility within an organization, right? It lets us validate how much time we use for learners and prove ROI back to the organization by saying, hey, we actually use less of the learner's time this year than we did last year, and improved performance as a result. And it also lets us be far more agile when it comes to creating content, right? One of the things that we often like to ask is, if you had to create a learning experience and launch a learning experience from scratch in under 8 hours, could you do it? By show of hands, who thinks they could right now? A few people, awesome. The reality is that as the world gets crazier and faster and more complex, many organizations have had to deliver learning faster than ever before, sometimes in really unfortunate circumstances, right? But the reality is that our teams have to move faster and have to be more agile. And this is an interesting metric that we can start to track over time as we think about meeting people where they are. One of the fascinating things as well is that learning naturally, when it emulates a conversation, naturally becomes bite-sized, continuous, and embedded in people's time and adaptable because it's more effective, right? Not because it's on a technology or innovation roadmap, right? Bite-sized learning isn't something we do over here. It's something that we embed into the flow of experiences when it supports the outcome, right? And I think that's one of the things that we like to think about is the reality is that the same way that many meetings could have been emails, right? Many SCORM files probably could have been text messages. So let's talk about where this fits within a modern L&D stack and what the L&D stack of the future might look like. And what we're going to talk about is, first off, what the modern L&D stack might look like. We'll then talk about what we teach and where, right? Because we want to be mindful of the fact that this is not a one-size-fits-all, and that certain types of content do fit better in other places within a learning stack. And then we'll talk about outcomes and best practices. So let's start from needs assessment. As we mentioned, if we pull data regularly via Slack or Teams or SMS, we can ping learners regardless of where they are, whether they're on the front lines or whether they're a busy executive, and in real time understand what their gaps and needs are, right? So from the beginning, we have far, far more data to inform how the organization functions. From there, we can create content in a far more agile way because it's text-based, and we only use video when needed, right? So we don't have to re-record videos, and we can also curate in a far more agile way, right? We're not limited to our content libraries. We can curate from any source, right? We can curate from LinkedIn Learning, or we can curate from YouTube, or we can curate from HBR, right? We can pull content from wherever it's relevant. And then from there, what we can do is make it accessible and ensure that the data is accessible anywhere, right? We are no longer tied to the LMS for data. And we can still send data back to the LMS if needed, but we can really enable our data to be portable and deliver it to business units and other parts of the organization so that they can use our data to validate business outcomes on their own. And at the very center of this, right, is delivering learning where people are in the tools that we use every single day. Right? And one of the really interesting things here is that content access and how we access content changes everything, right? And most importantly, it lets us track outcomes in a very, very long-term and holistic way. One of my favorite examples of this is the life cycle of a manager, right? And one of the cool things is that we already know the most critical moments in a manager's year. Right? We already know that they are going to go through performance review season at a specific time. We already know that they are going to have hard conversations at this point and at this point. And so what we can do here is actually pull data from the organization and trigger the right learning in the right place in the right time. And a few examples of what this looks like, right? Let's say you are a manager, or let's say you are an IC and you are promoted to be a manager, right? You're a first-time manager. Today in many organizations, you have to wait until there's a first-time manager cohort to engage in a first-time manager learning experience. And so we oftentimes have first-time managers who spend months without any sort of support. What we can do here is as soon as somebody is promoted to be a manager, we all can trigger, for example, a 3-month new manager pathway to train them gradually on the best practices for becoming a manager, and then actually send them nudges to take action on that. Right? And then from there, we can send along quarterly reinforcement to validate whether or not they still understand those concepts and are practicing them. From there, what we can do is if somebody's been in a role for over 2 years, and if we have a sense that they may need some career development or may need to start focusing on their development again, what we can do is we can send them automatically a 5-day career development course to refresh some of those really, really hard questions about what it is that they actually want. And then we can send monthly auto-reflections and nudges to additional learning content, right, to help them continue having that conversation on a regular basis. And finally, if performance review season is coming up, we can automatically trigger a 10-day anti-bias program that walks them through best practices as they're about to take action and as they're about to go into performance review season, right? And then we can send biweekly nudges for 4 weeks after to actually validate that they're taking action and that they're continuing to act in an anti-bias approach. Probably the coolest thing for me is that we can then use all of these learning experiences to gather tons and tons of data about what's working and what's not working, right? If somebody goes through a first-time manager program, we can actually use the data that we gather to prove whether or not they will be successful as a first-time manager and give them additional resources as necessary. Right? If somebody's been in a role for over 2 years and they go through a career development program, we can actually gather enough data to prove that, hey, we think they're going to churn. And then we can give them additional resources or notify their manager to help prevent them churning. With all of that in mind, the right content should be delivered in the right place, right? And the reality is that for content that's nuanced and collaborative and in-depth, it should still be delivered via in-person or virtual sessions, right? There's a really, really critical place for that type of content. And also if content is very, very complex or in-depth, it should still be delivered in the LMS or the LXP. What we find is that for most organizations, 80% of content is pretty foundational and fundamental. Right? And actually, it's an interesting audit to do internally. If you do an audit of your organization today, what you'll find is about 80% of the content that we deploy is getting people from 0 to 1, right? And what we find is that getting people from 0 to 1 is typically best done in very, very lightweight tools where people already spend their time, right? Foundational people skills, foundational onboarding, right? Really, really critical things that people need to practice and that need to be continuous and that need to be done over time. And the best part is once they've gone from 0 to 1, then we can bridge them into a really, really meaningful in-person experience, or we can bridge them into a really meaningful, LMS experience. But we are taking learners on a very, very gradual journey and then triggering additional more in-depth content only when the time is right. And again, one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that it's not a dichotomy between bite-sized content and full-length content, right? It's delivering the right content in the right place in the right time that creates the outcomes that we want. And it's really about starting from the outcome that we want and working backwards to understand how we can create a phenomenal user experience accordingly. And also how we can make content that's adaptable at the speed that the content needs to adjust. Right? If we're building an onboarding program, the reality is that that may need to change on a weekly basis, right? Whereas if we're creating a really, really foundational leadership development program, that may need to change on a yearly basis or on a bi-yearly basis, right? And so we can sort of flex the medium depending on how often that content changes as well. And so our tactical recommendation here is to start small but move fast, right? And as you all think about how to implement the new learning stack and build the future internally, think about how you can first off emphasize velocity, right? How can you build speed internally and make speed a core value for your teams? From there, how can you track more data to really prove outcomes and hold your vendors accountable for this, right? Like push them to give you more data. They have the data. And also, with that in mind, prioritize, right? The reality is that we're asked to do a lot, but we also have the power to push back and say, hey, based on our understanding, this is what's really important, right? And what we find is that doing audits and cutting out things that aren't really adding value is a critical part of ensuring that things are functioning well. And the last piece is to segment, right? For every part of our organization, right? For every part of a manager's life cycle or frontline employees' life cycle, we need to understand those 7 moments every single year where they lack confidence, right, where they need additional support. And what we can do is we can really map those moments, map the organization, and understand what needs to be pushed, what needs to be pulled, what needs to be delivered at scale, bless you by the way, what needs to be delivered at scale, and what needs to be delivered in a more personalized way as well. So with all of that in mind, today I'm incredibly excited to share some things that we're doing to drive the future forward. And one thing that I'll mention, just for some context, is we're not here to make learning smaller. We're here to make learning better, right? We're here to do whatever it takes to create meaningful learning outcomes. And in some cases, that just happens to be bite-sized learning delivered where people spend their time. And so today, we're announcing 3 really, really meaningful additions to Eris to drive the future forward. The first one is Eris Today is the world's most accessible learning tool, full stop. Today with Eris, learners don't need an email address, they don't need internet access, they don't need a work device or even a smartphone to access learning. And what that means is that for frontline employees who previously did not have access to learning, we can now compliantly deliver learning on their personal devices in a way that's both GDPR and SOC 2 compliant, but also in a way that truly meets them where they are. And we're releasing a few features to make this happen. First off, today, all Eris courses are delivered on toll-free numbers, which means that if a learner uses their personal device, they will incur no messaging charges for reaching content on their personal device. We're also adding in shift locking to make it really, really easy for employees to learn only during work hours. And that means that as organizations, we don't need to pay learners to learn. They can do so during work hours on a personal device without any cost to them. We're also launching secure wage and hour compliant opt-in, making it really, really easy to have sort of legal coverage when it comes to reaching employees on personal devices. And we're also launching no email sign-up, meaning that employees can enroll in an Eris course with just their employee ID and no email necessary, either by scanning a QR code or just texting a code to a specific number. And these are all features that we either have live today or are rolling out over the course of the next few months. With that in mind, once we've met people at the right place, we're really, really excited to announce far more features and far more tools to enable you to launch content faster and create really phenomenal learning experiences, but also drive incredibly high rates of adoption. A few things that we're launching here are, first off, our template library. We're now expanding our template library significantly and making it very, very community-driven, right? The best learning experiences are created by people in this room. And one of the things that we're doing is helping organizations leverage the power of community to create learning experiences that have worked well in other organizations already and can pull those into our classrooms as well, right? And we're also adding in far more templates that map the needs of the organization and map those 7 critical moments for every single individual. We're also launching Eris Pathways, a way to create much more meaningful skill-building outcomes over the course of months and years. Right? And so what we can do is we can actually string courses together over the course of 3 to 12 months and create very, very meaningful outcomes over the course of a longer period of time. Most importantly, all of this content is refreshed monthly and can be customized. And so we want to create a learning library that your team will use in real time. From there, we're also launching a lot of features to make it really, really easy to drive incredible rates of adoption, but also fulfill core communication needs, right? Today, one of the crazy things that we've learned is that it's really, really hard to deliver communications at scale and actually verify that people read them and took action on them. And so we're launching verified communications, a way for organizations to deliver the right communication to the right person at the right time on any device and platform, and actually verify that people took action and verify that people did what they were supposed to do with automated reminders to ensure that people actually take action as well, right? So no more chasing people for open enrollment, which is hopefully going to save folks some time. And the last thing that we're launching here over the course of the next few months is built-in course marketing, right? We want to make it easier for people to launch and market courses without having to send tons of Slack messages, tons of emails, and going to people individually to ask them to sign up, right? Because the reality is that today, as we mentioned earlier, 25% of our time is spent on driving adoption. And so if we can reduce that and give ourselves some time back, we think that would be a good thing. And so our goal here is to really drive meaningful adoption rates while automating a lot of these processes. And underlying a lot of this is new tools that we're launching to automate the learning experience. And not just automate the learning experience, but also drive dramatically faster and easier ways to deliver the right learning in the right place, most importantly, at the right time. A few things that we're doing here. First off, we're excited to announce 30, 60, 90-day check-ins to automatically track long-term behavior change and long-term knowledge retention, right? So we no longer have to check in with people manually. We can automatically see how people are doing in the long term and pull all of that data into one place. We're also excited to launch intelligent recommendations. Based on our understanding of learners' needs, we can now send automated AI-driven recommendations in the flow of work for courses that we think will be relevant to them. And what that means is that to enroll, folks just need to text back that this is a good fit for them, and they'll be automatically enrolled. We're also launching more in-depth HRS and LMS integrations to make it really, really easy to integrate Eris with your existing learning ecosystem. And we're also launching Eris automations. This is probably one of the features that I'm most excited for. We're essentially enabling you to seamlessly integrate Eris with over 50 tools, including tools like Salesforce, and trigger learning in the flow of work from any data point in the organization. What that means is that if something happens in Salesforce and we want to automatically reinforce something in Slack or in Teams, we can do that by setting up an integration in one click. And this is something that we're really excited to be rolling out over the course of the next year. Most importantly, all of this is done in an incredibly secure way and a platform that's fully SOC 2 and GDPR compliant as well. So, with all of that in mind, our ultimate goal here is threefold, right? We want to bridge the gap between learners and the ecosystems that you've already built. But we also want to seamlessly enable effective, research-driven, and continuous learning experiences that meet people where they are. And ultimately, what we want to do is give you and your learners time back to focus on the things that really, really matter. And sort of our top secret master plan is also to hopefully save you some budget and save you some time by dramatically simplifying the overall learning stack. Because today, we have to deal with a ton of tools, and our hope is to save you some time accordingly. So with all of that in mind, all of us here today are part of a movement to make learning more personal, more impactful, and more accessible. And at Eris, what we're trying to do here is really prove something. We want to prove that we can build an organization that not only creates successful learning and business outcomes, but an organization that can do that while being fundamentally good to our clients, to our peers, to our employees, and to the world at large. And so today, the thing that I'm most excited to share is that Eris is the first learning organization to commit to the TOMS model. And so for every course that learners are receiving, we will donate one to Learner in Need. Over the past year, this has enabled us to deliver over 1 million lessons to students in need, and we're just getting started, which is what I'm most excited about. One thing that I want you all to keep in mind over the course of the next few days is that the future isn't just happening, right? All of us here are in a position to shape it, and all of us here are creating it as well. What we also know is that it's not an easy journey ahead, right? Innovation and creating change is hard. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring you all together is to create community and to help each other through those tough times, right? Because we know it's not an easy journey. And I want to wrap up with one quick story. 5 years ago, this message completely changed my life. And about a year ago, I got a message from Mohammed letting me know that through his work with Eris and through his work with Tile, he had gotten a full ride to the American University in Beirut. And as a result of that experience, he was able to get access to an international exchange program that ended up with him being at the American University in Washington, D.C. And so last November, I had a chance to buy a plane ticket and fly to Washington, D.C. and meet Mohammed in person. And the reason I share that is because the work we do really, really matters. The work all of us do in this room matters immensely, right? The ability to change a person's life and the ability to create learning experiences for the 2 million people that we all serve is an immense, immense privilege. And we have both immense power and privilege in being able to create change, right? So I hope you all have a phenomenal next few days. Thank you so much for taking the time, and Godspeed. So before I pass it over to Shannon, I'd love to open it up for some quick Q&A, both about the next few days, anything else that you all want to cover sort of in the next 15 minutes or so.
Yes, my name is Jackie Parker. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I work for Global Payments. And I have both a question and a comment. I'll start with the comment. It was so exciting to listen to your heart, to learn about your journey, and to understand purpose-driven work. So that's my comment. My question is, in your study and research of looking at the trends that impact L&D, what are you seeing specifically for upskilling and reskilling team members?
Yeah, first off, thank you so much. And I loved your panel a few weeks ago, and I'm incredibly excited for your panel later, I think later tomorrow. So super, super excited to chat more in depth. I think it's interesting because with upskilling and reskilling, what I find is that people development is sort of implicit in upskilling and reskilling, right? So if we sort of break it down, when we want to upskill somebody, right, what we really want to do is take them from a place where they have a skill set over here and build either typically foundational and new skills right over here. And I think the same approach applies where, I'll use a specific example. If we want somebody to become a data scientist, right? And let's say they're currently a mechanic, we want them to become a data scientist, which is something that many organizations are focused on doing today. The reality is that if we take an individual and throw them into a data science program right away, they will fail in most cases, right? Because they will not be prepared to engage in the rigor of learning. They may have no clue what a data scientist is or what they want to do. And so what we find is that much the same way that marketing teams are really effective at sort of building lead generation before somebody's ready to, like hop on a demo or buy a product, we can do the same thing for creating really effective upskilling and reskilling programs, right? Before somebody is ready to go through a week-long, upskilling or not a week-long, oftentimes a multi-month or a year-long upskilling or reskilling program, we need to be able to get them up to the point where they have an understanding of sort of foundational concepts in data science, for example, and where they're comfortable and understand what they're about to do. So I think a lot of it, again, is sort of on getting people from 0 to 1 or 0 to 10 and sort of easing them into the point where they're ready to go through a really, really in-depth program. And I think the other consideration here is that for most upskilling and reskilling programs, as organizations, we invest a lot, right? We sometimes will invest upwards of $20,000 to $30,000 per employee to upskill or reskill them. And so we want to ensure that employees are both ready, but also that employees have context on what they're doing, why they're doing it, and can also engage. And I think the last piece that I'll mention here we're working with an organization, and this is something that we're going to be announcing later next year, and that I'm really excited about. We're working with an organization to build foundational cloud skills for employees who have no access to a laptop. And that's going to be something that we're going to be announcing. And one of the things that we've learned is that when somebody wants to learn about how to program for the cloud or what the cloud is, right, throwing them directly into a coding environment ends up scaring them. Right? And I tried to code, I failed at it, and it was largely because I was thrown into a coding environment and had no idea what I was doing. And it's interesting because if you go to a computer science class in university, a lot of what you're taught in the first 6 months is those foundational conceptual skills that can be taught in a much more bite-sized format that is fundamentally accessible, right? And our goal is that somebody can learn cloud skills, right? And learn the basics of cloud while on their bus ride home. And then after a few months or a year, can then make the investment and dive into a more in-depth program when they're ready and confident that's what they want to do.
Michael, I'll have a question for you. Giovanni Lucas, Nationwide, out of Columbus, Ohio. So one of the things that I think is transformational that we're seeing in the marketplace right now, you talk about learners wanting to, or having access to learning. But part of it is having the desire to learn, having the motivation to learn a new business that's completely foreign to them. So when I think about using your personal device, right, to access learning on your own terms, your own time, to achieve a career goal, talk to us a little bit about what your point of view is around connecting learning to passion, because I would offer that many of us are probably challenged with that a bit, right? As we introduce new associates to our organization, many of our organizations are very traditional, very technical. How do you bridge the gap between the access point, technology, and the desire to learn?
Excellent question. And also, before I answer that, I'm going to grab a drink of water real quick. Park City is unbelievably dry. Yeah, so excellent question. I think when it comes to the desire to learn, a few things that we can think about, right? The first one is, one of the really great things about TikTok, to sort of use that analogy, is that TikTok doesn't really care if you want to engage in a TikTok about a topic that you know nothing about, right? They just serve it up and see if you engage. And so I think one of the challenges that we've had so far, especially, and we'll have a more in-depth conversation about building a learning culture tomorrow. And I think we'll dive into sort of some of those core components. But one of the things that we find is that when we ask learners, hey, do you want to learn this? And we give them 400 different options, right? Learners get overwhelmed really, really quickly and easily, especially if the first touch point is an hour-long experience, right? And so I think what we find is that to drive that learning culture, it needs to happen gradually and slowly, right? Because we need to first tell learners, hey, here are the opportunities accessible to you, and curate them significantly, right? Give them just a few options. And then we need to say, here's some context on what you're going to learn, on how much time it's going to take. And to start off, it's only going to take a few minutes a day, right? And so that way we can sort of drip learning initially and then cascade it when the time is right. So I think, I think also your question about how to create change in more complex and traditional organizations is a really good one, and is one that we're going to chat about tomorrow more in depth, and that I have a lot of thoughts about that we won't be able to cover as much now. But again, I think a lot of it comes down to starting small, right? Finding ways to embed personalization and embed meeting people where they are in those small moments. One of my favorite examples of this is an organization that during their onboarding program, says, hey, here's some context on why you're here. I think it's really interesting because sometimes, even in onboarding programs, we actually don't remind people why they're there, right? And the same thing is true for learning experiences, right? We oftentimes don't tell people why they're there and what they're going to get from the experience. And when folks are, halfway through or midway through either their job or a learning experience, we oftentimes don't remind them. One of the things that we found interesting is over the course of the past 2 years, we've seen a massive spike in reboarding programs, right? Where employees that have been at an organization for 3 or 4 years they need to be reminded why they're there and what the organization does. And oftentimes, a lot of the challenges that we have with the Great Resignation and with retention is because folks don't know why they're there and what resources are available to them. So that's sort of our perspective is, start small, be super intentional, remind people why they're there, and sort of cascade things over time. Yeah. Oh, okay, sweet.
Hey, Michael, I've been to several conferences in my lifetime in my professional career, and I just want to commend you and your staff because, as I shared with you earlier, this seems therapeutic. It's almost like a therapeutic learning. So great job of putting together something that we conceptually can walk away from. So my name is Kelvin Goss. I work for Delek U.S. Oil and Gas. I oversee our diversity, equity, and inclusion building and philosophy, and it's just been an amazing journey. What I wanted to share with you today from a question and a commendation, I like the quote from Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, you do better. So in my research and opportunity to really dig deeper into understanding how DEI aligns with learning and development, my question to you, I think it's the first time in history we have 5 generations in the workplace. So how do you develop a process and connect with all 5 of those generations in a productive way? Because believe me, your opening commentary makes us want to run down here like we have an A+ report card and say, hey, our most precious asset, time, we've solved for it. We want to really go drive that. So how are you thinking about those 5 generations and how we can leverage that in your communication throughout this course?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think we ran an interesting study with Harvard Business Publishing a few years ago, where we wanted to understand, for sort of a communication-driven approach to learning, do different generations react to it differently? And what we found, to our surprise, is that folks over 60 prefer this approach by a few percentage points to folks under the age of 60. Which we didn't really understand initially. It seemed incredibly counterintuitive. And the reason why is because if you think about it, everybody sends text messages and everybody uses Slack and Teams. And the reason why specifically is, everybody texts their grandkids or their spouse or their friends, right? It's a medium that's really, really natural to all of us, right? My dad uses like a 2006 Motorola flip phone. He's kind of a Luddite, which is ironic, right? Given the fact that I help run a tech company, but and the interesting thing is that even he, right, despite having a very limited interest in technology, right, ends up using, ends up like texting my mom like okay, using like the 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like a kind of a crazy user experience. But what we find is that the lowest common denominator is what's accessible to everybody, right? And I think what we find is that when we're able to start with the lowest common denominator in terms of access, it ends up crossing generations significantly, right? And what I've found interesting as well is that a lot of our perceptions about what different generations want and need oftentimes aren't necessarily valid, right, as well, because I think there's, for example, a broad perception that folks over a certain age don't like TikTok. Personally, my dad, the one thing that he does use is TikTok on my mom's iPad, right? Like he's on there all the time. And so I think what we're finding is that technologies that are fundamentally accessible are accessible regardless of generations and regardless of background, especially when we meet people like on a language that they use, or when we build in support for folks with visual or auditory limitations as well, which these tools naturally do. So that's sort of our perspective there. Also, quick shout out to Lisa for jogging across the room. Much appreciated.
Hi, my name is Jay Erickson. I'm from Hitachi Vantara. Tying into that last question about 5 generations, I'm sitting here in the conference, I'm getting text messages from my 82-year-old mother who just wants to check in. I wonder if there's value in positioning an Eris course as something other than a quote-unquote course. Because I wonder if that's a hang-up that some people, even in L&D, have, right? You can't have a course in text messaging until, of course, they try it. But I wonder if we could break through with our learners and our business stakeholders by maybe phrasing it as something different. Maybe that's an internal thing that we need to do at Hitachi. Maybe that's something you think about. But getting away from the concept of a course to a learning experience.
I think that's an excellent point. And it's interesting, right? Because if we think about sort of where the concept of a course comes from, right, it really is rooted in the university model, right? It's rooted in this idea of like, okay, you're going to go to like a class for a few months, and fundamentally that's like all even digital courses today are not really that, right? That they've drifted away. So I think it's an excellent point. I think, and I do think that learning experience is far more accurate, right? The reality is it's, course also I think defines it as a one-time thing, which our goal is that it isn't, right? Our goal is that the learning experience is continuous. It evolves over time based on our understanding of a learner's needs, and that we can really deliver contextual learning based on what's necessary. So I think it's an excellent point. Yeah.
Hi, Michael. Mark Lemon with Intermountain Healthcare. I'm reflecting on one of your comments that consumers are wanting the push, the nudge more than the pull. And yet when I also talk to other leaders in and outside of HR, they want managers to own the team. They want caregivers and employees to own their careers, own their own development. How do those exist at the same time? What are your thoughts from your research or what you're just seeing?
Yeah, awesome question. So when we talk about managers owning their career, right, or for example, a nurse owning the owning the caregiver experience, we do want them to have that ownership, but we also don't want them to do that by themselves all alone, right? And I think what we're finding is that when we ask a manager to own their learning experience and their team's learning experience, we're putting a ton of responsibility and a ton of requests on them. And we want them to be in the driver's seat a little bit, right? But I think the analogy is like if you had a Formula One car, right, where every single time that the driver had to do a pit stop, they had to get out and change all of the wheels by themselves, right? It would take a while. And so I think the same thing applies here, where we want people to be in the driver's seat, but we also want to give them tons of support and resources and guidance at the right place and the right time to help them own that experience and to help remind them what they need to do, right? Again, if we go back to sort of the note about the manager life cycle, if we want managers to own career conversations for their employees and help develop their employees, we can still have them do that, but we can also give them tons of relevant and contextual guidance and give them the right nudges to help them do that in the best way possible as well. Awesome. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Hi, Chrissy from the Aspen Group. When you talk about access, what trends do you think you'll see in the next 5 to 10 years with cross-company or cross-industry content sharing?
Great question. I think it's something that's already starting to happen a little bit. I know it's something that we care a lot about. Look, I think a lot of the barriers that we have between organizations are they're barriers that don't really need to exist, right? For example, if we have we have many healthcare organizations in the room today, for example, two healthcare organizations are not competing for the same for the same audience, right? And typically, if they can work together, it benefits everybody, especially if they can work together on developing people, right? I think that's a common shared interest that every organization has, right? All of us here in this room are not competitors, right? We're here to create learning experiences for our people that make everybody better. And so I think over the course of the next decade, we will start to see far more forums and venues for collaborative knowledge, right? And for collaboration between L&D teams. We're starting to see it a bit. There's a few organizations that we work with that have started to partner on DI programs, for example, right? And have started to partner on best practices for career development. And one of our goals, with sort of our template library is to make that process more seamless as well, right? By creating a venue where folks can anonymize and share their content with others. But I think it's one of the greatest opportunities that we have, right? We have so much data between each organization on what works and doesn't work for our employees, right? And the more that we can share that data, and I think AI will help as well, right? As we start to use AI to make learning experiences more automatic and make them better and make them more contextual, AI can pull that data from all of our organizations, and learn from all of us. And so I think the trends are positive, and I think we will start to see a more collaborative environment as well. Awesome. Any last burning questions? Folks, thank you so much.